Daniel Weston stood outside his family's first bakery, staring up at the gold-lettered sign that read, Weston's Bakery. 5 locations now carry his name across California, a legacy passed down from his father. But he hadn't stepped foot inside this original Venice Beach store in almost 2 years. Reports from his regional manager had been fine. Sales were steady. Online reviews still raved about the fresh, handmade bread. And yet, whispers had started reaching him. Customers were overcharged for simple loaves. The pastries counted was wrong. Old man Luis, the 72-year-old baker who had shaped dough in his kitchen for over a decade, was quietly blamed for missing product. Something about all of it didn't sit right. Adjusting the worn baseball cap low over his brow, Daniel caught his reflection in the glass. Jeans dusted with flour, sleeves rolled, a small notepad tucked into his back pocket. Nothing about him looked like the CEO of a multi-store bakery empire. Perfect. He took a long breath and stepped inside, ready to listen, ready to watch, ready to find out what was really happening in the bakery that built his name. Daniel Weston sat quietly in the corner of his father's old bakery, the place where it all began. Weston's Bakery wasn't just another local store. It was an institution in the heart of Portland, Oregon. Generations grew up on the soft, buttery croissants, the hand-rolled sourdough loaves, and the famous cinnamon rolls his father used to make from scratch at 4 a.m. Now it was a chain, 6 locations across the state. Successful, polished, profitable. But for Daniel, today, none of that mattered. He wasn't here as the CEO. Today, he was just a silent customer, sitting at a worn wooden table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, hiding beneath a baseball cap and a weathered flannel shirt. He didn't want anyone to recognize him, because lately, something about Weston's Bakery felt wrong. Reports from the district managers looked fine. Sales were good. Reviews online still talk about the bread being perfect and the pastries being life-changing. But in the past 2 months, Daniel had heard rumors, whispers that made his stomach turn. Customers were charged more than the menu price. Limited edition pastries are sold at triple price. And worse, someone accusing Luis, the old baker, of stealing dough or ruining customer orders. Luis, a name from Daniel's childhood. Luis Garcia, now 68, was a man who had taught Daniel how to knead dough when he was barely tall enough to see over the counter. Luis was the reason Daniel fell in love with baking. And now, sitting quietly in the corner, Daniel heard them. 2 kids, maybe 10 or 11 years old, sitting at the next table, eating chocolate muffins, sand winging their feet beneath the bench. One leaned closer to the other and whispered, "Mom said that old baker keeps messing up. She thinks he's stealing." Daniel froze. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, flickered across the room. Luis was there, behind the glass counter, moving slowly but steadily, dusting powdered sugar over pastries with hands worn rough from decades of kneading, folding, and shaping. His back was slightly bent, but his presence was calm, quiet, respectful. Luis had always been like that, never raising his voice, never showing anger. But Daniel could see it now, something in his body language, the weight of years, the loneliness of someone who loved his craft more than he loved comfort. Daniel's heart sank. Who had told these kids that story? Who was spreading that image about Luis? And more importantly, why? Daniel stayed still, observing. His eyes moved the counter. Chloe, a young woman in early 30s. Sharp smile, fast with customers, charming on the surface. But Daniel noticed her behavior. Her fingers lingered over the cash register longer than necessary. He watched her quote a price slightly higher than the menu. He saw her glance quickly around before pocketing something small near the tip jar. Something inside Daniel stirred. Old instincts. Not as a CEO, not as a businessman, but as a little boy who once sat next to Luis in the early morning kitchen, watching him roll dough with the kind of love you couldn't fake. This bakery was built on trust, and Daniel Weston was about to find out exactly who had broken it. Daniel Weston stayed seated in the far corner of the bakery, his coffee untouched, growing cold beside him. From where he sat, he could see everything. The shelves lined with fresh pastries, the golden croissants, the sourdough loaves, the hand-painted menu hanging above the counter. This was the bakery he built with his father's recipes, a place once known for honesty and heart. But today, it felt different. He watched Chloe, the lead cashier, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes and perfectly styled hair, glide effortlessly between customers. She smiled just enough, charmed just enough. But Daniel had been in this business long enough to notice what most people missed. The small things, like how Chloe tapped quickly at the register, covering the screen from the customer's view, or how the price she just quoted for a simple butter croissant was higher than the number on the printed menu. He frowned slightly. It wasn't a mistake. It was a habit. His eyes shifted. Behind the counter, further back, was Luis, the man everyone called Old Luis. 70 years old, a lifetime of making bread, skin like leather from flour and sun. Her movements were slower now, but precise, methodical. Daniel watched as Luis carefully kneaded dough, his hands moving with a quiet grace that could only come from decades of love for this craft. But there was something else in Luis's body language, a heaviness, a tiredness that went beyond age. Daniel didn't have to wait long. A customer stepped up, a young mom, ordering a simple box of pastries. Chloe rang it up, and again, the price was higher than listed. The mom hesitated. "That's more than I thought." Chloe smiled, almost condescendingly. "We've had some price changes recently. It happens." Daniel clenched his jaw. It was subtle, not enough to make someone argue, but enough to add up day after day. Then, the moment he had suspected came. Minutes later, another customer approached, complaining. "I ordered 6 chocolate croissants, but there are only 5 in the box." Daniel's eyes snapped toward the counter. Chloe didn't even blink. "Must have been a mistake from the kitchen," she said casually, her voice carrying just enough for everyone nearby to hear. She turned her head, calling out loud, "Luis, you missed one again." Daniel watched. Luis paused, wiped his hands slowly on his apron, didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just nodded once, with a dignity that twisted something deep in Daniel's chest. Luis walked over, adding another croissant to box. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am," Luis said quietly, with no trace of bitterness. The customer softened, but Daniel's heart didn't, because he knew what had just happened. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Luis was being made the scapegoat for mistakes he didn't make by employees who thought no one was watching. Daniel's hands curled slightly into fists beneath the table. He thought of what he had overheard from the kids earlier. Mom said that old baker keeps messing up. She thinks he's stealing. Someone was feeding customers lies about Luis, destroying his reputation, piece by piece. And the worst part? Luis knew. Daniel could see it now. The way Luis moved with quiet resignation, the way he accepted blame without protest. He knew, but he didn't fight back. Maybe because people like Luis don't expect fairness anymore. They don't expect anyone to stand up for them. They just keep working, keep surviving. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight in his chest growing heavier. This wasn't just about a few overpriced pastries. This wasn't just about numbers. This was about dignity, about betrayal, and about a bakery that was slowly rotting from the inside while he'd been too far away to see it. Not anymore. Daniel Weston had seen enough. Tomorrow, he would follow Luis. Tomorrow, he would find out who this man really was outside these walls. And tomorrow, he would begin setting a plan in motion, a quiet plan, an invisible plan, but a plan that, when the time was right, would show everyone exactly who Luis was and who Daniel Weston was going to become again, not just a CEO, Not just a man chasing profits, but a leader, a protector, a son of the bakery, coming home. Daniel Weston waited until the last of the customers had left Weston's bakery for the night. He stayed in the shadows, just another man in a simple coat, blending with the early evening crowd of downtown Portland. Luis Ortega, the man Daniel once called his childhood hero, was locking up the bakery. He moved slowly. His back was slightly hunched, his fingers stiff from a lifetime of kneading dough before the sun even dared to rise. But what struck Daniel most wasn't Luis's frailty. It was his care. Luis checked every window twice, made sure the fresh bread tomorrow sign hung just right, and as he stepped onto the sidewalk, Daniel followed, quietly, respectfully, like a boy following his mentor once again. Luis didn't live far, just 4 blocks away, down an alley Daniel had never really noticed before. The building was tired. Peeling paint clung desperately to its bricks. An old mailbox read, Ortega, 3B. Daniel hesitated at the bottom of the creaking stairs, watching Luis climb them. Slow, careful, every step a soft battle. Daniel whispered to himself, "What have I done?" When he finally knocked on Luis's door, it was a mix of guilt and reverence. Luis opened it, surprised, then cautious. But when he recognized Daniel, not as a customer, but as a boy who used to sneak warm bread off the racks, his face softened. Daniel Weston. Luis exhaled, almost like saying the name released memory. They sat at a small table, no bigger than the prep station in the bakery. A single bulb swung overhead. The apartment was humble, too humble for a man who had shaped the very soul of Weston's bakery. Photographs lined the wall, not of fame or success, but of family, grandchildren, a daughter in Mexico. Luis sent most of his paycheck to me every month. Daniel sat there, staring at this world he had forgotten. He wasn't a CEO tonight. He was a student again, listening. Luis didn't complain. He didn't need to. He spoke of the bakery like it was a person, not a building. "I know they think I'm old, maybe too slow." His voice was calm. No bitterness, just truth. "But this bakery, it gave me a life here when I had nothing. I clean the tables. I knead the dough. I fix what I can because I owe her that." Daniel's throat tightened. Luis knew. He knew about Chloe. He knew about the missing bread counts, the whispers, the accusations. I've seen young ones raise their voices, raise the prices. Luis gave a small, tired smile. "But me? I don't raise anything, except maybe my hopes that people still care about good bread." Daniel looked around. A leaky faucet. An old radio plays faint Spanish songs from decades past. An envelope on the counter marked for family. Inside, crumpled bills. His paycheck, ready to be sent home. The weight of everything hit Daniel like flour dust the face. The bakery he built wasn't broken because of numbers on a report. It was broken because he left its heart behind. And its heart was sitting right across from him. Luis poured Daniel tea. Simple, warm, like everything he did. "I never wanted much, Daniel." Luis's eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen enough to know what mattered. "I don't need titles. I don't need medals. I just need to bake bread that makes someone's day better." Silence sat between them. Heavy, sacred, Daniel whispered, more to himself than to Luis. "Weston's bakery used to stand for something." Luis looked at him, eyes steady. "It still can." When Daniel walked back into the cold Portland night, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who had just been given a second chance. A second chance to fix what he didn't even know was breaking. And this time, he wouldn't need a board meeting. He wouldn't need a quarterly report. He would need his hands, his heart, and a plan. Because Weston's bakery wasn't just built on flour and butter. It was built on people like Luis. And Daniel Weston was about to remind everyone of that. Daniel Weston returned to Weston's bakery that night, long after the last customers had gone home and the bright display lights had dimmed. The air smelled of butter and vanilla, the remnants of a long day. But tonight, Daniel wasn't here to admire the scent of fresh bread. He was here for something far heavier. He moved quietly, like a man who no longer felt like the owner of this place, but just another witness to how far it had drifted from its roots. He opened a small black case from under his coat. Hidden cameras, not for revenge, not for drama, but because truth, real truth, didn't come from assumptions. It came from watching the world when people thought no one else was watching. Daniel placed the cameras carefully in the corners of the shop, one behind the counter where Chloe worked her charm. Another is near the cash register. A third tucked near the kitchen, facing Louis' humble workstation. He stepped back, looked around the bakery, and whispered to himself, "This is not the place my father built." The next morning arrived like any other. The bells on the bakery door chimed. Customers flowed in with bright eyes and sleepy smiles. Children pressed their noses against the glass displays. But Daniel, in his simple jacket and cap, sat quietly in the corner, blending in as just another early riser with a cup of coffee. He watched, and it didn't take long. Chloe, charming, bright, and polished, greeted every customer with the kind of energy that would have fooled anyone. But Daniel caught it all, charging an extra $1 on each croissant, pretending the large cinnamon rolls were out when there were plenty in the back, just so she could upsell the smaller, pricier ones. Most customers didn't even notice, but Daniel noticed everything. And then came Louis. Quiet, tired, gentle. His hands, those old weathered hands, kneaded dough with the precision of a master craftsman. No shortcuts, no compromise. But Daniel's heart tightened when he saw what happened next. A mother with her little boy approached the counter. She ordered a dozen pastries. Chloe rang her up, inflated the total. And when the mother hesitated, looking confused, Chloe raised an eyebrow. "It's market prices," Chloe said with a shrug. "We adjust daily." The mother reluctantly paid, her eyes dimming. Daniel watched as Louis saw the interaction, his brow furrowed. He walked quietly to the woman before she left, slipped a small paper bag into her hands. Inside, extra pastries, his own gift, paid from his own pocket. Louis said nothing, just gave a small nod, like a man who didn't want credit, only to protect the dignity of a customer. Daniel gripped his coffee cup, hard. This wasn't just a good man. This was the heart of Weston's bakery, and it was being crushed in silence. But the worst was yet to come. Later that day, Daniel witnessed what nearly broke him completely. A special order, a birthday cake for a little girl, went missing. A mistake? Maybe, but Daniel's camera caught the truth. Chloe had deliberately set the cake aside, claiming it was never made, so she could sell the smaller, less costly version and pocket the difference. When the frustrated customer confronted the staff, Chloe turned to Louis. "Did you forget to order again, old man?" she snapped. Louis stood there, frozen, his face lined with quiet humiliation. He didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He simply bowed his head. Daniel felt something shift inside him, something raw and ancient. This was not the bakery his family had built. This was not how they treated people who gave their soul to their craft. Louis wasn't just being disrespected. He was being erased. That night, as the last light in Weston's bakery flickered off, Daniel stayed behind. He watched the camera footage again, frame by frame. Chloe's deception, Louis's silent kindness, the truth unfiltered. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, tired breath. And then he picked up his phone. Tomorrow would not be business as usual. Tomorrow would not be polite silence. Tomorrow, Weston's bakery would remember who it was. And Daniel Weston would remind every person inside those walls that legacy is not built on profit. It's built on people, on dignity, on the quiet hands of an old baker who never asked for recognition. Tomorrow, the truth would rise, like bread in a warm oven, patient, steady, and impossible to stop. It was early afternoon when Daniel Weston returned to Weston's bakery. But this time, there was no disguise, no old jacket, no fake customer routine. This time, he was coming back as himself, the rightful owner, the founder, and the man who had once promised this place would always be built on honesty, not profit at all costs. Daniel stood at the entrance of the bakery for a long second. He looked around. The same golden sunlight spilled through the windows. The smell of warm croissants drifted in the air. But beneath that was a wound, a crack in everything this place was supposed to stand for. Inside, Chloe was doing what she always did, moving between customers with her perfect, sugary smile. But it wasn't real. And today, everyone was about to see that. Daniel stepped inside. Heads began to turn. Whispers spread through the staff like ripples in a pond. That's him. Is that Daniel Weston? Chloe's eyes caught his, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was no smoothness, only panic. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. When leadership is real, presence speaks louder than volume. He walked slowly to the center of the bakery, customers looking on, staff holding their breath. Then, without theatrics, without drama, Daniel placed a small device on the counter. He clicked a button. The TV screen on the bakery wall, usually playing cozy visuals of bread being baked, flickered. But this wasn't marketing footage. This was raw truth. Clear security recordings began to play. Chloe whispering to another staff member, raising prices above menu rates. Customers being told the wrong total. Staff pocketing cash from extra orders that never existed. And worst of all, Luis, the old baker. On video, he took out crumpled bills from his own wallet, paying for missing loaves, covering the shortage, not because he was guilty, but because he refused to let a customer walk away feeling cheated by Weston's bakery. Because this bakery was his home too. Gasps broke through the crowd. Customers whispered in outrage. One elderly regular shook her head, whispering, "I knew Luis would never steal. I knew it." Daniel's gaze never left Chloe's face. Her mask had shattered completely. Chloe stammered, This is taken out of context." Daniel's voice was calm. "I wish it were." He turned to the rest of the bakery, his words steady, cutting through the air like a knife. Weston's bakery has never been about selling bread. Pause. It's always been about trust. He gestured to the footage still playing. And what I've seen here is not just a violation of policy. It's a betrayal of every customer who walked through these doors believing in us. Without raising his voice, Daniel turned back to Chloe. "You're dismissed, effective immediately." The other staff members involved fired on the spot. But Daniel wasn't done. He looked toward Luis, who stood at the far end of the bakery, flowers still on his apron, tears burning quietly in his old, kind eyes. Daniel crossed the room slowly, in front of customers, staff, and the very walls that had seen everything. He extended his hand. "Luis," Daniel's voice softened, "you never stopped believing in what this place could be, even when I did." Luis hesitated, not out of pride, but because humility was built into his very bones. Finally, with trembling hands, he shook Daniel's, and the bakery, once tense, broke into applause. Customers stood, regulars nodded, and Daniel Weston felt like he had come home again. But true leadership doesn't end with exposing the wrong. It begins with restoring what's right. Daniel turned back to the room. "We will be lowering prices to reflect our real menu starting today. Anyone who feels they overpaid, come see me." He paused. "And there's more." He smiled at Luis. As of today, Luis will be stepping into a new role, our master baker and mentor to every new generation that walks through these doors. A small plaque would soon hang on the wall, engraved with Luis' name and a simple phrase: "A good baker leads with hands, but works in the heart." Daniel didn't stop there. This wasn't about saving face. This was about setting the foundation right, so no cracks could return. We will open free community baking classes for children and anyone who wants to learn. And from this day forward, Weston's Bakery will have a fund dedicated to supporting workers who need help, just like Luis once did for all of us. In the quiet hum of the bakery, customers began to line up, not for refunds, but to shake Luis's hand. Daniel Weston knew one thing for sure. It wasn't about the bread. It was about the people. It always had been. Daniel Weston didn't sleep much that night, not because of anger that had burned away hours ago. What stayed with him was Luis, that quiet, stubborn pride, that battered pair of hands, rough from decades of kneading dough, from cleaning counters long after everyone else left. That little plastic bag of coins Luis carried not because he owed the bakery anything, but because he owed it to himself, to his craft, to the customers who trusted a name on the door. Weston's Bakery, his father's name, his family's name. And for a long time, Daniel had forgotten what that meant. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the Beverly Hills location before sunrise, not in a suit, not in his CEO uniform, but in a simple baker's apron. The smell of yeast and sugar hit him like a memory, one so powerful he paused in the doorway. He walked straight to the back, where Luis, as always, was already at work, measuring, kneading, shaping. Luis didn't even turn around. "You're early," he said, his voice calm. Daniel stepped closer. Quietly, "You were right, Luis." Now Luis turned. His eyes were tired, maybe even guarded, but behind them there was a flicker of surprise. "I was right about what?" Daniel took a deep breath. "That somewhere along the way, we stopped making bread with our hearts and started making excuses." Luis watched him carefully. "What now, Mr. Weston?" Daniel smiled, not the CEO smile. The old one, the boy who used to sit on this very counter, watching Luis shape loaves. "Now we fix it." By noon, Daniel had already summoned every store manager, not in a conference room, but right there in the heart of the bakery. He stood beside Luis. The room was silent. Some of them shifted awkwardly. Some looked worried. Most didn't dare speak. Daniel's voice was steady. Weston's Bakery was never just about profit margins, or fancy locations, or Instagram likes. He glanced at Luis. It was about people like him. He gestured to the framed picture now hanging above the counter, a candid shot of Luis. Flour dusted on his face, hands in mid-motion. Underneath it read, "A good baker knead with hands, but works from heart." Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Daniel announced publicly, for staff and customers alike, that Luis would be taking on a new role, Master Baker. Not just a title, but a mission. Luis would train every future baker, not only in technique, but in integrity, in respect for the craft, in pride for every loaf that left their ovens. And for the first time in a long time, there was applause in that bakery that wasn't just for show. It was real. But Daniel wasn't done. He called a press conference that afternoon, right there in the bakery courtyard. Reporters came, sensing scandal. What they got was redemption. Daniel stood beside Luis. He didn't hide, didn't sugarcoat. "We failed. I failed, not because of numbers, but because I let a culture of carelessness creep in." He paused, and it almost cost us the heart of this bakery. He looked at Luis. "But not anymore." Daniel announced sweeping changes. Every customer overcharged in the past 3 months would receive refunds, with a handwritten apology from Daniel himself. Weston's Bakery would implement transparent pricing systems in all stores, with printed menu boards and digital receipts. Profits from the next 2 weeks would go to a community fund for food-insecure families in the area. And most importantly, Luis would be given full creative control to design a new line of community-inspired breads, profits of which would support local food banks and immigrant baker education programs. But what hit hardest wasn't the policies. It was Daniel's final gesture. He turned to Luis and handed him a small box. Inside, a replica of the very first bread knife Daniel's father gave him as a boy. But engraved on it now were the words, "For Luis, who never forgot what we were baking for." Luis didn't speak for a long time, but when he did, it was just one sentence. Soft, almost inaudible. "Thank you for remembering." That night, as customers lined up outside Weston's bakery, not because it was trendy, but because it was real again, Daniel stood by the window, watching Luis teach a group of kids how to shape dough. He smiled, not because the damage was undone, not because it was perfect now, but because something stronger than business had returned. Something no scandal could destroy. Trust and love, baked into every crust, every corner of that little bakery. It wasn't the end, but it was the right beginning. Louis stood quietly in the early morning light of Weston's bakery, the familiar scent of warm bread rising from the ovens behind him. But this morning felt different. For the first time in decades, he wasn't here simply as the old baker in the back. He was here as Master Baker Luis Ramirez, the heart and soul of the place finally restored to its roots. Word had spread quickly across Brookhill about what had happened. The local news had picked up Daniel Weston's emotional public apology. Customers, new and old, were flooding the bakery not just for their favorite pastries, but to shake Luis's hand, to tell him what they should have told him long ago. "Thank you for being here," an elderly woman whispered, clutching his hands. "You baked for my family for years. We just never knew." Luis smiled shyly, always humble. But Daniel Weston? He wasn't letting this moment pass quietly. Weeks after the scandal had shaken the bakery, Daniel was already turning his vision of redemption into reality. The new sign at the front window now read, "Weston's Bakery, handcrafted bread, honest hearts." Inside, a large portrait of Luis hung on the wall with a quote beneath it. Words he had once told a young Daniel when teaching him to knead dough. A good baker kneads with his hands, but works from the heart. It became the new motto of the business. But Daniel wasn't stopping there. The Luis Fund was born, a community initiative to support underprivileged bakers, immigrants, and workers struggling in silence. Every purchase made at Weston's contributed to it. And Luis? He started what he thought he'd never do, teaching. Every Thursday afternoon, the back room of Weston's turned into a small classroom. Folding tables lined up, rolling pins ready. The students? Children from the neighborhood, single mothers, new immigrants trying to learn a trade, young people who didn't want fast money. They wanted meaningful work. Luis taught them not just how to bake bread. He taught them patience, pride, integrity. "You don't rush good bread," he would say, dusting flour across a wooden table. Same with life. Daniel often sat quietly in the back of these sessions, watching. Sometimes it stunned him how much one man's quiet kindness could ripple outward. He realized something else, too. This bakery wasn't about him. Not anymore. It never really was. Months later, the bakery hosted its first community baking day. Families lined up down the block. Louis stood in his apron, hands dusted with flour, surrounded by his students. Tyler and Ben, the same kids whose whispers had set everything in motion, were there with their mother. This time, they weren't whispering about rumors. They were laughing, kneading dough, learning from Luis himself. Daniel caught their mother's eye across the room. She mouthed, "Thank you." Daniel Weston felt something settle deep inside him, a peace he hadn't known in years. That night, after the bakery closed and the streets of Brookhill grew quiet, Daniel stood outside Weston's bakery. He looked up at the silver letters glinting on the glass, but his eyes weren't on his own name anymore. They drifted down to the words right beneath it, Luis Ramirez, Master Baker. And beneath that, where every loaf tells a story, narrating softly in his mind, perhaps already knowing one day someone would tell this story, Daniel thought. We build businesses thinking about success, about numbers, about growth. But sometimes we forget that the real legacy is built in the hands of quiet people. People like Luis. The kind of people who keep showing up, who keeps giving, who chooses kindness when no one is watching. That was what Weston's Bakery had become now. Not just a place that sold bread, but a place that restored faith in people, in hard work, in second chances. And as Daniel walked away into the night, one thing was certain. Some stories end quietly. Some stories end with applause. But the best stories? They never really end at all. They live on in every loaf shared, every lesson passed down, every heart forever changed. And in Brookhill, that story would always smell a little like fresh bread. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons in life don't come from loud speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes, they come from a quiet man in a flour-stained apron. Luis never asked for recognition. He never needed applause. He just showed up every single day with his hands steady and his heart honest. Maybe that's the real meaning of success. It's not in the numbers on a report, not in the size of a store, not in the shine of a brand name. True success, it is measured in trust, in integrity, in doing the right thing, especially when no one is watching. Because in the end, a good bakery doesn't just make bread. A good bakery makes memories. It makes a community. It makes people feel seen. And a good life, it's just the same. What we build with kindness, what we give without expecting anything back. That's what lasts longest of all. And maybe that's the only legacy worth leaving.